Greetings of peace and blessings, everyone. My name is Imam Sohaib Sultan, and I serve here as the full-time Muslim chaplain at Princeton University out of the Office of Religious Life. About 10 years ago now, we started the Muslim Life program, which seeks to educate the general public and to engage in a conversation with the general public, as well as our students and our staff and our faculty here at the university on Islam and Muslim cultures, Muslim societies. And part of our programming for the last 10 years has been this program, this series that we call Islam in Conversation. And so this is an Islam in Conversation series, and we're really excited today to be exploring the life and the legacy of one of the great figures of the 20th century, perhaps the greatest sports figure in American history, by the name of Muhammad Ali. We have a wonderful panel that's been assembled today, and I want to introduce them very briefly before we begin. And I wanted to offer some of my own thoughts, which is that today we are thinking about Muhammad Ali in the American context, but we also know that he's a global figure, and that he brought pride not only to black people in America, but black people all over the world, and not only black people, but also, I would say, Muslims. And one of the examples of that is when Muhammad Ali, may God rest his soul, passed away now about 2 years ago. We were all sitting around the TV and as a family watching his memorial service. And I remember that my mother-in-law, who grew up in a small village in Bangladesh, she started reflecting on how her father used to wake them all up, her and her siblings up in the morning, to listen on the radio to Muhammad Ali's fights, right? And that was something that they took great joy and great pride in. And I think that part of the legacy of Muhammad Ali is that he became a voice for people who were experiencing and going through and becoming free of the colonial project, right? That he became a voice for the voiceless, and that he became a voice for people who had especially, I think, gone through a very dark period of colonialism in which being Muslim, being black, being brown, these things were subjugated. And so as we think about Muhammad Ali, I know that each one of you probably have your own stories, and there must be personal reasons why you're here. This is, I think, a unique event. Sometimes people come to a lot of our programs because there's an intellectual connection, but here I think with Muhammad Ali there's probably very much a personal connection, both among the panelists as well as the audience. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And I'm really grateful for the panel that has been assembled. So I want to introduce them very briefly. First, we have Jonathan E., who is coming to us from Chicago, and he will be offering reflections for the first 20 minutes. And he'll be speaking primarily about his book, Ali, Alive. And there are copies outside which he will be happy to sign afterward and for you to purchase. Ken Burns calls Jonathan Eig a master storyteller. Eig is the author of 5 books, 3 of them New York Times bestsellers. He was born in Brooklyn and graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. This book that has now come out about Muhammad Ali is being celebrated as probably the most epic biography that has been written about Muhammad Ali. And there are awards that Jonathan has been receiving, and a lot of accolades. Ali was named Best Book of the Year by Sports Illustrated, and one of the 10 Best Nonfiction Books of the Year by the Wall Street Journal. It was a finalist for a PEN America Literary Award, and the William Hill Award, and an NAACP Image Award. And so we're really excited, Jonathan, to have you. Thank you for coming all the way from Chicago to be with us, and we look forward to your remarks. After Jonathan speaks, we will have our panel respond and offer their thoughts and engage in a conversation before opening it up to question and answer from you all, the audience. And to help us with that conversation, we have our very own Princeton University professor with us, and his name is Joshua Guild, and he teaches in the African American Studies Department here. And Joshua Guild specializes in 20th century African American social and cultural history, urban history, and the making of the modern African diaspora, with particular interest in migration, Black internationalism, Black popular music, and the Black radical tradition. And from a personal standpoint, many of the students that I work with who take classes in the African American Studies Department say how much they look forward to the classes that Joshua teaches. And so we're very grateful for his scholarship and his presence here at Princeton University. In addition, we have with us, sitting next to Joshua, Zaheer Ali. And Zaheer Ali is the oral historian at Brooklyn Historical Society, a nationally recognized urban history center founded in 1863 dedicated to preserving and encouraging the study of the history of Brooklyn, New York. Currently, he's directing Muslims in Brooklyn. My wife is from Brooklyn, so maybe she'll make it to your piece. A 2-year multifaceted public history project designed to amplify the stories of Brooklyn's Muslim communities and contextualize those stories in the broader history of Brooklyn. In addition to Brooklyn, his scholarly interests include Malcolm X, Prince, Rogers, Nelson, Islam in America, and 20th century United States history. And then seated next to him is Donna Auston, who is a regular here in the Muslim Life program, and we're very excited that she has accepted our invitation once again to be here. She is completing her PhD at Rutgers University in anthropology, and she is particularly interested in the African American Muslim experience and story. And after Muhammad Ali passed away, she was on a lot of different networks being interviewed, and she had a lot of thought-provoking comments and stories and details to share about the life of Muhammad Ali, which I think oftentimes was not being picked up in the national discourse and in the national media. So we're very grateful for all of your scholarship, Donna, but especially at that critical moment when Muhammad Ali died, to bring his full story to the table. Not everyone was able to do that the way you were. So thank you so much. So as you can tell, we're in for a treat, right? And without any further ado, we'd like to invite Jonathan to come and offer some remarks before we move it to the conversation on the panel. Please join me in offering a warm greeting.
Really an honor to be here with you tonight and to be with this panel. I'm going to keep my remarks short because I want to hear what they have to say. Whenever Ali would get introduced in front of a crowd like that, he would always turn to the person who introduced him and say, "Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. You're not as dumb as you look." You can only do that when you're a heavyweight champ, not when you're 5'7", not as good looking as Ali. But Ali, when he passed away, as you'll remember, was remembered not only as the most important American sports figure of all time, but the most important and best-known American Muslim of all time. And that's kind of an understatement too, in a way, because he was, for much of the 20th century, the best-known man on the earth. He was the most instantly recognized man on the earth. And a big part of that was because of his religious faith. It was boxing that made him a star, and it was boxing that carried his actions and his image around the world via satellite TV. But it was his name and his religion that made him so interesting to people like your mother, who would wake you to hear his fights. This was someone different. This was somebody who stood outside and apart from what the rest of the world knew of America. And a big part of that was his name and his religion. So I want to talk a little bit about just how Ali came by that name and religion a little bit, just to give you a little background on what I learned about it. And then we'll hear from people who are in some ways more expert to comment on some of these issues. But for Ali, and for so many people really who have a religious awakening in their lives, these religious awakenings often come at a moment of great discovery, a moment of great tragedy. They're often accompanied by some other change in your life that is dramatic. And for Ali, this is a kid who, just to give you a background, was raised in a Baptist church, was never very interested in religion. He grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, in the 1940s and 50s at a time of great segregation. And one of the problems he always had with the church in which he was raised was that he didn't understand why all the murals were white people. Why was Jesus? Why were all the people he saw depicted in these murals, why were they all white? And his father was the man who had painted those murals. So it even made it even more confusing for him. And he was always sort of challenging questions about race as a child. Why is it that we have segregation? Why is it that black people in Louisville can't shop in the same stores, can't go to the same movie theaters, can't go to the same schools as white people? He would say to his mother, well, you're lighter skinned than Dad. Does that mean that you can pretend you're white? And he would ask why he can't be rich like the people he saw with the big houses on the other side of town. And his father would say, well, you'll never be rich because of the color of your skin. And young Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. never really accepted that, never really felt like the answers were good enough, but he didn't, like so many other people, didn't know what to do about that. Until he discovered boxing at the age of 12. How many people know the story of Muhammad Ali's stolen bicycle? Few people know it. It's one of these great myths, one of these great stories of an awakening that happens to be true. So often as a biographer you investigate these origin stories and they turn out to be fabricated, but this one's true. 12 years old, Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay Jr. is riding his bicycle. He's got a $50 Schwinn, which is a big investment for his family. It starts to rain. He ducks into a building to get out from the rain, and when he comes back outside, his bicycle's gone. He goes looking for a police officer to report this, finds a white police officer in the gym, in the basement of a building where there's boxing gym, and this white police officer offers to give him boxing lessons. And this is a real moment of, a real eye-opening moment for young Cassius Clay, because first of all, his father has always told him to stay away from white police officers. Second of all, he looks at this boxing gym, and he sees black people and white people boxing in the ring together. He sees black kids punching white kids in the face. You're not supposed to be able to get, white police officers are not supposed to be nice to black kids, and black kids are definitely not supposed to get away with punching white kids in the face. So suddenly he understands that there are different rules within the four posts of a boxing ring. And he takes to this. He takes to boxing in a big way. Becomes really excited about it, begins training, loves the attention that it brings, loves the fact that here's a kid who does not do well in school. He's dyslexic. He struggles with his reading, with his writing, but he gets attention for boxing, and people give him a sense of approval. Even his father, who's a tough guy and a heavy drinker, even his father shows some respect for these skills that he's got in the boxing ring. And he begins to train hard. He begins to run to school instead of taking the bus. And he begins to imagine that there's a way out of these expectations, these standards that his father has told him are imposed. Maybe he can be rich. Maybe he can be different. And then, I think it's easy to imagine how you might say, if there are different rules within the four posts of the boxing ring, where else might be there exceptions to these rules? Where else can I defy what people say black people in America can and can't do? And in his travels as an amateur boxer, he gets to leave Louisville. Something his father never got to do. He gets to travel by car, by bus, even by train, occasionally by airplane, to places like Chicago, to places like San Francisco, to places like New York. And in Chicago in particular, he begins to hear the word of Elijah Muhammad. He begins to hear a record that he buys and takes back home with him, a recording of a song called The White Man's Heaven is the Black Man's Hell, which is recorded by someone known at the time as Louis X, who would later become Louis Farrakhan. And he takes this record home with him and begins listening to it over and over and over until he's got it memorized. And the point of the song is that these rules imposed on what black people can and can't do in America are rules written by the white man, and this is how the white man preserves his sense of heaven by ensuring that the black man will remain in hell. This is the message he takes from this song. And it begins to play with his head a little bit. I found a letter that Muhammad Ali wrote that had never been seen before, where he wrote about the moment when he decided to take Islam seriously. He said he was coming out, he had already heard this record, he had already heard about Elijah Muhammad, but he's coming out of a roller skating rink in Louisville, and he sees a crowd across the street. This is Ali writing it in his own words. And he wonders if maybe there's some pretty girls in the crowd, so he walks over there. But then he sees that it's a man selling copies of Muhammad Speaks, the Nation of Islam's newspaper. And the man selling the newspapers offers him a copy, and he doesn't really want one, he doesn't like reading, but he takes one to be polite. And he thumbs through it before he's prepared to throw it away. And he sees a comic, cartoon. And he describes this cartoon in the letter. He says that the cartoon is a picture of a black man praying in Arabic. And the white slave master overhears him and comes out and whips him and says, no, you don't pray in that crazy language. You pray in English. You pray to Jesus. You pray to the Christian church. And continues to whip the slave. And Ali says in this letter that he was so struck by this cartoon that he kept the newspaper, didn't throw it away as he planned. And he really began to think about this. The fact that he was a Christian, this was a religion that had come to him from slavery. This was a religion that had been given to his people, that had not been their choice. And as he began to process this, he realized too, and he heard Elijah Muhammad and later Malcolm X speak about the fact that his name too, Cassius Clay, was a name that had been given to him in slavery. So why did the black man have to take all these things? Why couldn't he have his own identity? So that his first introduction to the Nation of Islam and to this new religion that would become his own is really heavily built around race. It's about what is expected of him and what is restricted as a black man in America, and how this message might help him get around that. And all his life, Ali wants to be different. He wants to be a contrarian. He wants to defy expectations. This goes back to his childhood. So as he begins boxing and becomes a professional boxer and starts winning fights, you see these two things going. You see his continuing interest and his study of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. You see him befriending Malcolm X and really taking on a role of the mentee to Malcolm as the mentor, and sort of a big brother, little brother relationship. You also see Ali at the same time recognizing that he wants to be different as a boxer too. He wants to defy expectations. So one of the things that was so radical about Ali, that made him so disliked, but even before people found out about his new religion, was that he was a loudmouth. His original nickname was the Louisville Lip, because he talked back so much. And at the time in America, 1950s, in the sporting world, you were supposed to be sportsmanlike. You were supposed to be gracious to your opponents. And especially if you were a black man in Jim Crow America, you had better be respectful of your white opponents. You had better not brag. Joe Louis, the great heavyweight champion, was always told not even to raise his arms when he knocked out an opponent, because it would be seen as bragging, and black men in America did not brag about their performances. But Ali said, forget that. I'm going to do it. I'm going to piss off as many people as I can. And he modeled his behavior a little bit after Gorgeous George, this wrestler who would wear his hair in curls and spray perfume on himself. And he recognized that if he made people angry, they would come to see him fight, and that they would be more likely to give him a shot at the heavyweight championship because he would be more famous. You didn't have to be loved to be popular. You didn't have to love for people to buy tickets to see you fight. So by 1964, he gets his shot at the heavyweight championship against Sonny Liston. By now, there are rumors that he is seen with Malcolm X. The promoters of the fight actually are so worried that if Ali is believed to be a member of the Nation of Islam, that it will drive away customers. They won't be able to sell tickets because Sonny Liston, his opponent, is already one of the most hated black men in America. So if you're not going to root for Sonny Liston, and you're not going to root for this young, braggadocious, upstart kid, who's going to buy tickets to this fight? So they actually asked Malcolm X to leave Miami before the fight, to get out of town because it's bad for the marketing of this fight. Malcolm does leave and comes back in time to see the fight. And when Ali wins, knocks out Sonny Liston, he stands in the center, and Malcolm X had been saying to Ali to give him confidence, this is a fight for religion. This is a fight for your identity. This is a fight for the soul of this country. They think that he positioned as if it were a battle against Christianity, and Ali took this very much to heart. And when he wins that fight, when Sonny Liston stays on the stool and gives up the heavyweight championship, Ali jumps around in the ring and says, I am the greatest of all time. I talk to God. I talked to God, and God told me I was going to win this fight. Well, Malcolm X had told him to win the fight, I'm not sure about God. But the next day at his press conference, one of the reporters says to him, is it true, Cassius, that you are a card-carrying member of the Nation of Islam? Card-carrying was a loaded term that was used to describe communists. But and Ali turns on that immediately. It's card-carrying. What does that mean? What is card-carrying? I was a Christian. I was raised a Christian. I was baptized, but I didn't have any choice about it. And now that I have a choice, I'm not a Christian anymore. I believe in the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. My religion is Islam. It's a religion practiced by millions and millions of people around the world. You don't need a card. You don't need to carry a card. I am free to be who I want. I am free to worship the way I want. I'm free to say what I want. And nobody can stop me. Those were radical words. They're radical words today. Look what happens when Colin Kaepernick decides that he doesn't want to stand up for the Nation of Islam. We get upset about black athletes speaking their minds. Do you think what Colin Kaepernick has been getting is harsh treatment? You should see what Muhammad Ali went through. A few months later, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. This was a name that was given to him by Elijah Muhammad. He was, for about 3 days, he was Cassius X, because he wanted to get rid of his slave name, and he copied Malcolm and took the X, which is what most members of the Nation of Islam did. But then Elijah Muhammad called and said, I'm giving you a special name, in part complicated reasons to drive a wedge perhaps between Muhammad and Malcolm, but we can talk about that later. But Ali gets this name, this honored name, that will resonate around the world, but the American media refuses to acknowledge it. For years after this, they continue to call him Cassius Clay. One or two reporters, Howard Cosell deserves some credit, he immediately began saying, he wants to change his name, who are we to say? Howard Cosell had changed his name because it sounded too Jewish, so maybe Cosell could understand. But the mainstream press, the New York Times, everyone else, for years, continued to call him Cassius Clay, as if he didn't have a right to choose his own religion, to choose his own name. But during the same time, Muhammad Ali begins to realize that this name means something not just to members of the Nation of Islam, not just to black people in America, but all over the world. He travels to Arab countries, he travels to Muslim countries, and he's a hero in places that he didn't even know that people had heard of him. And he begins to realize, he says, I'm the heavyweight champion of the world. Not just the heavyweight champion of America. These people see me as something special. And if Ali didn't already have a big enough ego, it started getting even bigger. So he comes back to the United States, and throughout the 1960s, he is perhaps the most hated man in America. Certainly the most hated man among white Americans, but even among many black Americans, not so sure. I mean, Martin Luther King actually criticized him and said he should stick to boxing. He doesn't know what he's talking about. There was a lot of anger toward the Nation of Islam, in part because they were generally opposed to integration, opposed to the mainstream civil rights movement, and Ali was an outsider to that movement. So he had a lot of support in certain more radical parts of the movement, but not within other parts. So you could argue that he was the most hated man in America, certainly in white America, for much of the 1960s. And when he refuses the draft, when he refuses to fight in Vietnam because of his religious beliefs, he becomes even more despised and is stripped of his boxing license, stripped of his heavyweight championship, and convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Now, a lot of people forget that when Ali, we all know that Ali was out of boxing for 3.5 years as a result of this conviction. And we say, wow, he sacrificed 3.5 years of his prime as a boxer, 3.5 years of his prime as a moneymaker when he had millions of dollars of endorsement deals on the table. But Ali didn't just sacrifice 3.5 years. He believed that he was giving up his entire career. He did not know that he was ever going to be allowed back in the ring. He truly believed that he was going to spend the next 5 years in prison. He lost appeal after appeal on his case. And only in 1970, when a couple of states ruled that it was unfair to take away his boxing license, because convicted felons are still allowed to box. In fact, without convicted felons, boxing ranks practically annihilated. Only when a couple of state courts ruled that Ali was allowed to box was he allowed back in the ring. And then later in 1971, after Ali was already boxing again, the Supreme Court, on a technicality, reversed his conviction, and Ali was allowed to become a boxer. This is a really interesting turning point in Ali's life, because he has to make a choice. For those 3.5 years when he was out of boxing, he was a martyr. He had shown with absolute certainty that he was sincere about these religious beliefs. A lot of people thought maybe he was just doing this to get out of the war, that he was exaggerating his belief in Islam in order to just save his hide so he wouldn't have to go over there and fight. But he proved beyond a doubt the sincerity of his religious beliefs, sacrificed 3.5 years and was willing to sacrifice his entire career. But when he comes back in 1970, 71, he discovers that, wow, he really likes boxing again. And he really likes being popular. Something really astonishing happens. 1971, when Ali fights Joe Frazier, for the shot at the heavyweight title again. It's a chance to be the champ again. A title that the government took away from him. He loses that fight. He gets knocked on his rear end in the 15th round. And I believe this is the moment that really changes Ali's life, perhaps more than any other, perhaps more than his decision to resist the draft. He gets up in this brutal, brutal fight. In the last round, he gets up and he finishes that fight. And even though the judges decide that he was the loser, he starts working his way back toward another shot at the heavyweight title. And that's when Americans begin to look at him differently. They say, wow, this is a tough dude. This is a guy who took the punches that Joe Frazier threw at him, took the punches that the American government threw at him, stood by his religious beliefs, fought through all that unpopularity, and he's back, and he's still fighting for what he believes in. And at the same time, you kind of have to like the guy. He has this charisma, he has this charm, this twinkle in his eye, so that even in the 60s when he's saying that all white people are blue-eyed devils, yeah, we hear you, but we still kind of want to hug the guy. He's charming in ways that no matter how radical he is, you can't help but relate to him in a way. And now that the 70s are underway, we see that he was right about the Vietnam War. We see that the Nation of Islam isn't quite as radical as it seemed anymore. There are more radical elements. There are people blowing up post offices all over town. And Ali is on TV clowning around with Johnny Carson, and how bad can he be? And America starts to open their hearts to him in ways that they never had before. And the world has always opened its heart. Outside of America, he's more popular than ever now. He works his way back toward another shot at the heavyweight championship. This fight against George Foreman takes place in Africa, of all places, in Zaheer, of all places. And Ali is now an international star, an international symbol, and this becomes a fight in many ways for the status of who's the baddest black man on earth. And it's taking place in Zaire and the Congo, and George Foreman seems like the toughest man that Ali's ever faced. Ali seems to have no chance, and Ali somehow wins this fight. Now, I'll tell you just a funny story, because I've been not really capturing Ali's great humor, and then I'll wrap it up and we can talk to the panel. But when Ali gets to Zaire, Ali was famous for taunting his opponents. He always had to prove that he was the biggest, baddest, toughest guy, and he often used race. He would call Joe Frazier an Uncle Tom. He would call Floyd Patterson the white man's champion. When he's on the plane to Zaire, he says to his manager, "Are they going to understand what an Uncle Tom is here?" And his manager says, "No, probably not." He says, "Well, what can I do? Who do they really hate over here?" And his manager says, "Well, the Belgians. They really hate the Belgians." So Ali gets off the plane, and there's thousands of people there greeting him in the middle of the night in Kinshasa. And he gets off the plane and he raises his arms and says, I am the greatest of all time, and George Foreman is a Belgian. and Foreman arrives the next day and can't understand why everybody hates him already. But Ali gets in his opponent's heads, he's having fun, and he beats George Foreman, he becomes the heavyweight champion again. And when he gets back to the United States, he gets a phone call from Elijah Muhammad, who by now is in his 70s and who's been more than a mentor to Ali, but has really been more than a guru. Ali believes he's a prophet of God and has always obeyed. And Elijah Muhammad says, you must quit boxing. You've proven everything there is to prove. You're the champion again. You've made millions. Quit boxing while you still have your health, and come speak for your religion. And Ali can't do it. He can't give up boxing. He goes on to fight another 7 years. Takes terrible toll. Takes far too many punches. And when he finally retires, when he's forced to retire after losing his last 2 fights, after losing 3 out of his last 4 fights, after being reduced to the point where he's becoming difficult to understand, his voice is being silenced, this beautiful, beautiful man is being brought down by too many punches taken. When he finally retires from boxing, he does what Elijah Muhammad said. He travels the world, he becomes an ambassador. He tells people that in the Islamic world, he tells people that Americans are not so bad. America is a diverse country. We have all kinds of people, all kinds of religions. And he tells people overseas that, he tells people in America that Islam is a religion of love. And especially when we have these acts of terrorism here, he's called upon by his government to become a representative, to speak up and to speak out and to educate people about his religion. And he embraces Orthodox Islam. He after Elijah Muhammad's death, he begins to really study the Quran in a way he never did during Elijah Muhammad's life. And he really becomes deeply engaged in his faith. And I believe the last 30 years of his life are really spent for Ali. Well, 2 things. One, he loved to watch himself on YouTube. He loved to watch his old fights. And I would too if I was that pretty. But he also devotes himself to his religion. And he says over and over that he believes that he calls it the tallying angel, an angel keeping track of all of the good deeds and bad deeds, and that to go to paradise he needs to have more good deeds than bad deeds. And I'll close with just one of the many lovely stories I heard about Ali and his attempts to square things with the tallying angel to go to paradise. One day in late 1980s, in the 1980s, Ali was kind of lost. He was depressed. He didn't have enough to do. He didn't look good on TV anymore and wasn't getting invited to appear on television. This is before he lit the Olympic torch and was kind of rediscovered. One day there was a knock on his door, and there was an old man with a little boy. The old man said they'd come from Tanzania looking for Ali, and this old man wanted his grandson to meet the great Ali. And they had gone to Chicago first because they thought that's where Ali lived, but now he was in Los Angeles. They'd been driving around for days trying to find Ali's house. And the old man was carrying a McDonald's bag, and he offered it to Ali as an offering, he brought you a Big Mac. And Ali welcomes them in and spends all day with this old man and his son. Goes into the kitchen, makes them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and then gets in his Rolls Royce and drives them back to their motel at the end of the day. And his manager says to him at the end of the day, what was that all about? Why? All you had to do was shake their hands and sign an autograph. Why? And Ali said, I did a lot of bad things in my life, and this is the time where I need to make up for it. And I think that he was sincere. Ali was a cut-up, and he was provocateur, and he did many things in his life that confounded me. He did not always treat his wives well. He did not always treat his children well. But the one thing that you can say for him is that he was always true to himself. The great jazz pianist Thelonious Monk always said, the real genius is the one who's most like himself. Ali was always like himself. There was never any bull about him. I think that's why we love him. That's why even the people who hated him in the 60s, even the people who still today struggle with his politics and with his religion, even today, even those people have come to see Ali as a man who was genuine, whose feelings were out there for all of us to see. And I think that's why he resonated with us, and why we're still talking about him today, and why we'll probably be talking about him again in 100 years. Thank you very much.
Working? Yeah. I'll start with a confession, and that is when I first heard about Jonathan Ives' book, sort of up to its publication, I was skeptical. In part because, there are quite a few books about Muhammad Ali, and some of them are actually quite excellent. But what I realized, and what Jonathan Ives has said in interviews, is that those books just deal pieces of Ali's life. And what the task that he took on with this, and has delivered on quite marvelously, is to tell the whole story as best he could. And to try to tell Ali's life and his career, his politics, his sporting life, his family life, all of that together into one very hefty, but very readable book. Jonathan Ives talked to everybody he could talk to. He spent 4 years or so researching and writing this book. Talked to everyone, tried to get an interview with Muhammad Ali himself while he was still alive, and had a meeting, met him, had a chance encounter, which maybe he'll tell us about. But really talked to virtually everybody who was important in Ali's life, or who knew him in any capacity, and brings all of that to bear in this book. There's a few threads that I picked up on, or that I think are maybe relevant, that maybe we could discuss. And the first is maybe the most obvious, and that's the biographer's challenge of taking up both Muhammad Ali as symbol and Muhammad Ali as man. And I think, with almost no exception, I think Jonathan does a really incredible job of doing that. Because to me, that task is both separating those two things, separating the symbol from the man, but also uniting them, threading them back together in some capacity. This book does not shy away from Muhammad Ali's flaws, his many infidelities, his parenting, his sort of self-absorption, and so forth. But none of those things, of course, diminish from the overall picture we get of this person and this, what he meant to many people, both in this country and globally. Islam, and the kind of long arc of Islam and faith, I would say, in Muhammad Ali's life, both inside and outside of the Nation of Islam, is another important thread. We see and follow how Muhammad Ali's beliefs evolve over time, particularly later in his life. That, to me, was quite eye-opening, because I didn't know too much going into this book about how the role that Islam played in his later life. Third, and this is related, this book does a marvelous job of plumbing the kind of triad, the relationship between Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Elijah Muhammad. And we might even add Louis Farrakhan in there as well. It's a very complicated set of relationships. Each one needs the others in different ways at different moments. Each one has their own kind of political motivations, their personal motivations, sometimes financial motivations. And there are many reasons why those who survive might want to tell a certain set of stories about those relationships. And I think Jonathan does well to get sort of inside of all that and offer us an assessment of that for himself. Then there's this question of protest, which is so central to Muhammad Ali, both the person and the icon. What I talks about is protest as a way of life. He writes sort of in the middle of the book, sort of chapters around the Vietnam sort of episodes. Right? Quote: Ali wanted to make everything he said and everything he did a protest. Really interesting. I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about what that meant. Sort of outside of the specifics of his opposition to Vietnam, but sort of both before a little bit of what you said in your opening remarks about how he wanted to position himself vis-a-vis the expectations that white America had for him, and what was sort of possible in the 1950s and 1960s, but also then moving forward. How do we sort of unpack protest? How do we think about protest? And how do we follow that thread without overstating the argument, without finding protest in everything that Ali did, and maybe find other motivations for some of the things he did? I'd be interested to see what my colleagues think about all of that. But this is really a tremendous book, and I really took away from it a real appreciation for the way that Muhammad Ali was both an agent and a vessel at the same time. And that is a difficult thing to do as a writer, for me as a historian, but as a biographer as well, to sort of see a person as an individual with their own motivations, but also see the way that other people's expectations, other people's views of them also shape who we come to understand them to be. So it's a wonderful book, and I thank you for it. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Zaheer.
Okay. So, I have a very special relationship to Muhammad Ali because my last name was Ali. And, growing up, I'm not going to say what decade, but growing up at a time where Arabic names were not prevalent, I grew up in Maryland. As a kid, people would literally just ask me, are you related to Muhammad Ali? To the point where I just started saying yes. And even a few years ago, I was at a very prestigious literary event in New York City, and this woman came up to me. I'd given a talk, and this woman came up to me, and she kind of tapped me on my shoulder, and she said, are you related to Muhammad Ali? And I just looked at this lady, and I was like, I am not going to disappoint you. I don't know why my father didn't just name me Muhammad just to get it over with. He too he's a big boxing fan, and my family's from Trinidad, and my father always tells me the story of the 1964 Declaration. And I think my father always uses the term declaration, and for people who understand Islam, the first pillar of Islam is called the Shahada, the Declaration of Faith. And so whether or not people knew the nuances between the Nation of Islam and what we call the global super tradition of Islam was not really relevant, because people heard on the radio or they read in the paper that Ali declared himself a Muslim. And that was such a huge deal, as you alluded to the point that when Malcolm, so this happens February 1964, and in April, Malcolm makes the pilgrimage, right? He's left the Nation of Islam, he goes to make the pilgrimage. And while he's waiting, or while he's staying in one of the tents, as part of the 10 days, people are coming up to him because they're hearing the rumor that this is an American Muslim, which was such an odd thing. And they think he's Muhammad Ali. This is before, people have pictures and stuff. And they keep coming up to him, mistaking him for Muhammad Ali, because they just know he's an American Muslim. And so that is how much that name came to signify so much more than just that person. I mean, it really came to embody the entire population of American Muslims in that name. What I want to think about, and I think some of this Josh has tapped on to, as well as Jonathan, is that when Muhammad Ali passed away 2 years ago, there was a lot of lionizing, there was a lot of memorializing by people who would not be seen with him at some of his, what I consider, most heroic moments, right? And he certainly had many heroic moments. I mean, from the sports perspective, all of the fights, and you detail them. I mean, now it's really tragic. I was saying to Jonathan earlier, as you read the book, I had forgotten how many times Ali came back into the ring. So every time I turned the chapter, and I was like, oh, come on, Ali, stop fighting, because we know how the story ends. But for many people who are into boxing, there are these heroic moments as a fighter. For many people, his stance against the Vietnam War was a heroic moment. For many people, his lighting the torch in the '96 Olympics in Atlanta was a heroic moment. But one of the things that I felt got lost in the memorializing of Ali was how unapologetically Black, unapologetically Muslim, and unapologetically Black Muslim he was. And this is part of his declaration. I mean, his saying, and he started saying, I'm the greatest before he became Muslim. But this is almost like takbir, like for Muslims who know, Allahu Akbar means God is the greatest. So when Ali is saying, I am the greatest, I mean, he's signifying on that declaration. But what I thought was interesting is the way that the Supreme Court decides to overturn his case on a technicality, but it was prompted by, and you tell the story so well, it's prompted by, you know, it's a decision is a 5-3 decision. Thurgood Marshall has recused himself from the vote. So it's a 5-3 decision to uphold the conviction. And one of the, I think Justice Harlan, had a law clerk who was a Columbia Law School graduate and probably an anti-war sympathizer, goes to Justice Harlan and says, you know, this is not just a political objection that Ali has, right? In order to be a conscientious objector, you have to, say I'm not going to fight in any wars. Like it's against my religion to fight in any wars. And the way that the Nation of Islam had articulated its refusal to serve in the U.S. military was both a combination of religion and politics, right? Like we're not going to fight in the white man's army because they're not defending us. We won't defend them. And this law clerk gives to Justice Harlan Elijah Muhammad's Message to the Black Man in America and tells him, read it. And the judge reads it. And I had the passage because I thought it was really fascinating, this passage that the justice reads or cites from Message to the Black Man, which was published in 1965. It was a collection of Elijah Muhammad's articles. So this is Elijah Muhammad's writing being quoted. The very dominant idea in Islam is the making of peace and not war. Our refusing to go armed is our proof that we want peace. We felt that we had no right to take part in a war with non-believers of Islam who have always denied us justice and equal rights. And if we were going to be examples of peace and righteousness as Allah has chosen us to be, we felt we had no right to join hands with the murderers of people or to help murder those who have done us no wrong. We believe that we who declared ourselves to be righteous Muslims should not participate in any wars which take the lives of humans. So, the justice reads this and agrees, like this is a religious belief, and goes back to the other justices and decides to change his vote. So it's now a 4-4 tie. And they are hesitant to overturn the case on the merits because, as you write, because they are fearful that if they say that Ali is justified in not fighting because he's Muslim, that maybe thousands or tens of thousands of black men will want to join this religion to avoid going into the war. So they do it on a technicality. That's something that the appeals court hadn't done correctly. And so it's overturned, but not with the reasoning. But what I liked about this story is that it highlighted how politics and religion are inextricably linked in this story, and how one of the things that I think, people, when we talk about the tradition of African American Islam, and especially in the tradition of the Nation of Islam, is a way that sometimes delegitimizes or undermines the legitimacy of the Nation of Islam's religiosity because of its emphasis on politics or on race, as though no other religion has race as a transcript, right? Certainly, Billy Graham just passed away. He was, for many years, a white American nationalist that combined that with evangelical Christianity. But it was unspoken, it was unwritten, it was not commented upon. No one delegitimized Billy Graham and said that's not religion, right? And I think what the Nation of Islam did was bring it into full relief, how religion and politics are inextricably linked. And I think one of the things we have to keep in mind when we talk about Muhammad Ali is the Ali that we praise is the Ali that comes out of a tradition that is both political and religious, that is black and is Muslim and is unapologetically black Muslim. And I'll close with this quote that I like, that Ali said, "I am America. I am the part you won't recognize. but get used to me. Black, confident, cocky. My name, not yours. My religion, not yours. My goals, my own. Get used to me.
Good evening.
It's on. I think you just need to hold it closer to it.
Josh, do you want to? Yeah, that's better.
All right. So good evening. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to try and enter the conversation from a slightly different perspective. There's a lot of material to work with, obviously. Ali's life is very rich, and this volume does a really good job of covering a very broad spectrum of Ali's life. So it was a challenging task leading up to this particular event to kind of think about how to zero in on something that was significant enough to capture some of that. So I stopped trying to go broad and just tried to weave a few things together that maybe would supplement some of the discussion that we've already had. Interestingly enough, and I swear to God, we did not plan this, but my comments actually end with the same quote that Zaheer just said. So yes, because it does capture a lot of it. And so some of my work is about really thinking about Black Muslim activism in the present as a part of a genealogy, and thinking about how not only what produced Ali, right, but kind of what we're seeing in the present and how that links to traditions of protest in the past. And so that's kind of almost the tack that I took to try and weave some of these things together. So I'll just read more or less from some of this just so that I hit all the points that I wanted to make. I remember also for me personally, and this is, my comments will somewhat reflect this, that I inherited a love of, I learned of Ali from my mother. My mother introduced me to boxing and football, which is kind of where my comments today will go, to kind of think about some of the things that we link those two phenomena together. So, anyhow, I don't really like the idea, I guess, of darkening our gathering with this woman's name, but because she just said something that's relevant to what we're talking about here, I will hope you will excuse me. But Laura Ingraham, in her recent comments about, in regard to LeBron James and Kevin Durant's, little video clip of talking about and criticizing President Trump. When she said in response to that they should just shut up and dribble, right? It provides an excellent backdrop for some of the things that I was thinking about. And many of the landmark events of Ali's life illustrate this belief forcefully. So this brings me, so I started to think about this, and I started to think about bell hooks. And bell hooks has an essay titled Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance. And she brings attention to the often pervasive, perverse pressure that attends racial difference. She talks about, she says that the commodification of otherness has been so successful because it is offered as a new delight, because it's more intense, more satisfying than normal ways of doing and feeling. Within commodity culture, ethnicity becomes spice, seasoning that can liven up the dull dish that is mainstream. Brooks's reflection made me think about the delicate balance that is often expected of Black athletes, where Black bodies and the ways that Black bodies are offered up for violent consumption in the world of sports, with the expectation that they will provide white America with just enough but never too much spice. And this is reflected in Ali's biography in ways that are likely obvious to anyone who studied his career, and what my co-panelists have shared tonight will certainly illustrate that. But I think about him as belonging to a genealogy that both precedes and follows him. From people like Jack Johnson, who was, in many ways, was way too spicy for white America, to the humble, right, in quotation marks, Joe Louis, who had just enough flavor for white America's palate, to John Carlos and Tommy Smith, and to athletes who came later, notably the Black Muslim Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, and people like Colin Kaepernick. and the other athletes who have followed him in taking a knee. And in another way, in a slightly different way, but I think still related, at least in my thinking, to athletes such as the Williams sisters, whose very presence, they haven't been necessarily explicitly verbally political, but the very presence of their very black bodies in the very white world of professional tennis has drawn some interesting attempts to tone down or invalidate the intense flavor that they bring to the game. And while we're contemplating the transgressive natures of black women's bodies in the world of professional sports, it's worth considering that the most politically controversial Super Bowl halftime shows to date both involve black women. Janet Jackson and Beyonce, right? So I think about Bell Hooks's use of consumption as a metaphor, particularly when I read this biography, when I read his descriptions of the greed and the corruption in the world of boxing, in the way that Ali's trainers and others in his camp looked away from signs that the sport was having adverse impacts on his body, on his health. Again, bringing me forcefully to the present and the NFL controversies over the pervasiveness of CTE among football players, and all of which, again, brings me back to the very beginning of my comments in thinking about the widely held belief that white America has the right to violently consume the bodies of black athletes, but no corresponding responsibility or obligation to respect their position in the world as fellow citizens or human beings with a right to agitate for greater freedom. And Ali, of course, rejected these constraints in the most memorable ways, subversively refracting these expectations through a lens of intertwined blackness and Muslimness. And that is the essence, I think, of what makes him the greatest of all time, is that particular intertwining. And two quotes of his illustrate this powerfully. And I pulled this from Jonathan's book. One of the things that was striking to me when he was talking about some of the ways that he wanted to be rich so that he could be free, right? But he also said, Jonathan quotes him as saying, like, I wanted to be rough, tough, arrogant, the nigger that white folks didn't like. And I think about this kind of knowing something about the full context of Ali's life and his personality. And I interpret that as being is less about individual or particular white folks and more about the ideology of white supremacy. He wanted to be the type of black person that white supremacy would not find palatable. And this is what Hooks would call white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, excuse me. And then, of course, lastly, the other quote that bookends that was exactly the quote that Zaheer read. And I'll read it again because it's just so fabulous. He says, of course, that I am America. I am the part you won't recognize, but get used to me. I'm black, confident, cocky. My name, not yours. My religion, not yours. My goals, my own. Get used to me. Thank you.
I wonder if we could.
Maybe you all can just share the lapel mic.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe one place to start is with one of the threads that I pointed out, because I think it touches on all of this, and that's Muhammad Ali as icon. How do we think about Ali as an icon, and in particular, an icon for different groups of people, globally and nationally, right? And maybe adjacent to that is really thinking about the end of Ali's life, and thinking about this creation of him as a symbol that takes a certain kind of valence in sort of the last 10 or 15 years when he's diminished physically, he can't speak for himself in the ways that he once did, and gets the Presidential Medal of Freedom and all the rest, and how we think about that span of his life and career with respect to the part that we all like to focus on, the kind of high point of protest of the late 1960s, how do we think about this symbol, and how do we sort of pull it apart and think critically about it?
I'll start. Thanks. It's really complicated to think about Ali in those last years when he's silenced and a lot of the image making is going on beyond his control. And I think there were a lot of Ali fans who, when George W. Bush offered him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, would have liked to have seen Ali reject it and say, not until you stop these wars against my people. But it was difficult because one of the problems I have with it is that we tend to, when we turn him into this saint, we make him into this safe figure. That Stanley Crouch had a great line. He said that Ali, in the '60s, was a grizzly bear. He's wild. He's dangerous. He's completely uncontrollable. By the '70s, he's a circus bear. He's still dangerous, but he's entertaining, and we'll pay to see him. And then in the last part of his life, he's like a teddy bear, and we all just hug him. And I think does a disservice to Ali because we only love him when he's harmless. That's not right, and I think that's partly what makes his image at the end so complicated. But I'd love to hear what you guys.
I would definitely, I think, echo some of what Jonathan has shared here, and I think that it's an interesting thing that we do with figures of Ali's type. Right? If we think about, for example, much of the modern discourse around Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King is all warm and fuzzy, and it's like, y'all killed him, though. So the ways that many of these very radical figures transform over time, some of that, of course, in King's case, King is dead, so he's not evolving in that way. And Ali was living for a lot of the day. So there's some differences in terms of how that, because I think Ali was also doing things differently with his life. And I think as a Muslim, right, as somebody who's intimately familiar with some of the transformations of the faith journey, I think have a lot to do with that, because how one articulates a political position in relationship to racism and anti-war activity and all of the things that Ali became so famous for Black Muslims in the U.S. as a collective. These are issues that people are trying to sort out through the lens of their faith. So people are converting to different movements of Islam, and that's sometimes with a radically different or at least drastically different kind of political articulation of some of the same issues. Even the organization that kind of directly became the heir of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam, right, undergoes deep transformations both in faith and politics. And Elijah Muhammad's son articulates a very different relationship to America and the state than his father. And the Muslims who followed him, of which Ali was included, are going through those transformations as well. So I think in terms of the symbol aspect of it, most Americans aren't privy are really, or at least not aware of those nuances and not really thinking about it in the same way. But at the same time, there's this kind of corresponding process that tends to happen with all or many radical figures of that type, where we're just slowly defanging people as we go along, right? So Ali's case is very complicated, right? Because I think you have multiple things going on over the course of his life, and certainly will continue to go on after his death, in terms of how various groups of people latch onto and interpret the essence of who he was.
I think of, so Ali lived longer than a lot of the icons that we kind of are able to much more easily freeze, right? I think of Ali and Malcolm. And we don't know what Malcolm would have become had he grown older. The Quran has this thing where it says, some of you
we take in the womb, meaning some people never come to birth. Some of you we bring out of the womb and we bring to adulthood, and and some of you we bring out of the womb, and I'm paraphrasing to the Muslims before y'all take me out. And some of you I know, right? And some of you we bring out of the womb, we bring to adulthood, and we return back to a childlike state, right? And Ali was that third category. I mean, he was returned back to a childlike state. So there's just a lot of Ali to kind of get to. But one of the things that's interesting, so Malcolm X was believed to be like a fire-breathing dragon, right? For people who saw him on the media and stuff. But for people who met him personally, they saw him smile. He would crack jokes. He would laugh. I mean, like white people, right? Like there's this, these white journalists who are apprehensively approaching him because they got to do a story, and they turn out like, oh, you're not like this person that we have imagined to be. And we were talking before, and one of the people that Jonathan interviewed for his book was Minister Farrakhan, and he talked about how I would say disarming a personal encounter with Minister Farrakhan can be. I think about Ali in that way, that, the demonization of black nationalism, such that anyone who is a proponent of black nationalism is stripped away of any semblance of human dimension, of joy, of humor, of laughter, of gentleness, and that's not what these folks were about. It's very similarly to the way that segregation was never really was not necessarily primarily about keeping people separate. It was about keeping people from being in the same space as equals, right? Because if you were somebody's butler or maid, you could be in the whites only car, right? You could be all up in their house. But you just couldn't be there as their equal. And what black nationalism was trying to do was to become an equal, right? And so for people in the Nation of Islam, they would engage white people, but they would engage white people as a sovereign citizen of another country. I'm a citizen of my country, you're a citizen of your country, and when we meet each other, we are two sovereign citizens sitting down on an equal playing field. So people were puzzled about Ali becoming a member of the Nation of Islam, but having all these white people around him and working with him and all that stuff. But it wasn't that it was a contradiction. It was that it was very much a shift, right? And so he didn't have a problem laughing with you and joking with you, but he knew what he believed. And so I think part of that gets lost before we even get to the late 80s and 90s, that this was the same person all along, but we didn't see it because his politics blinded us to his humanity. And when his politics changed, we saw the humanity. We're more open to seeing the humanity of certain kinds of politics, I guess is what I'm saying.
I'd love to add to that because it ties back to something you said earlier. Just to add to that, Malcolm X's autobiography, which was published posthumously, was intended to reach a mainstream audience, and it did, and it helped humanize not just Malcolm but the Nation of Islam. And one of the really interesting footnotes to that is, how did the law clerk that you talked about, how did he know to read Message to the Black Man? How did he know to take that book and to show it to Justice Harlan? Well, it's because this young law clerk had been an anti-war protester at Columbia and had read Malcolm's autobiography. So he knew that the Nation of Islam very much was based on a very real religion, and it was not just this thing that white people were scared of, that it had real meaning and real religious validity, and he took it seriously and then was able to, so it may have been in some ways Malcolm's last gift to Muhammad Ali in saving him from conviction.
Faith journeys and conversion narratives are often framed as individual stories, very personal stories. But of course, they almost always happen in communities and in the context of families. And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the women in Muhammad Ali's life and their how his relationship with his mother, his 3 wives, and maybe other women impacted his kind of religious and spiritual journey along the way. That struck me as a kind of really important element in this story.
And a dangerous one too. I'll start, but you guys better bail me out. So Ali and women is always a very sensitive and difficult subject, but it is an important one. Ali gets a lot of his sort of precocious behavior from his father, who was a wild guy, and he gets his sweetness and his charm from his mother. His mother was the more religious of the two. And his parents were deeply upset when Ali joined the Nation of Islam. They thought he was being brainwashed. And Ali's brother, he only had one sibling, his brother joined the Nation as well at the same time, so they felt like their children were being taken from them. And then when Ali married for the first time, it was a girl he'd been introduced to by Elijah's son, Herbert Muhammad, who later became Jabir Muhammad. But she was not a Muslim, and eventually he got pressure from the Nation of Islam to divorce her. So here's a real turning point. Here's a real dilemma. He truly loves this girl, but she won't convert and won't even wear the conservative clothes that Muhammad wants her to wear, and he has to make a choice between his faith and his wife, and with great difficulty he divorces her and really struggles with it. He's never quite sure if he made the right decision, because he continues to feel love for her, but he chooses his religion, and then soon after marries a young woman who was raised as a member of the Nation of Islam. She's only 17 years old when they marry, but they're married for 10 years, and then he marries another woman who's not a Muslim, and then in his 4th wife he marries a woman who converts when they marry. So, as always with Ali, he doesn't make it easy to interpret his actions. He's clearly trying to be a good Muslim and he wants his wives to be involved in the faith, but he's not always as strong as he would like to be, I think.
I think I'll try to cover it from a slightly different perspective, and just think about the ways that, particularly within the context of the Nation of Islam and Black Islam more broadly, is that the ways that community's history is often told is from a very male-centric point of view. And so the community that embraced Ali and that taught Ali and that became a haven for him and a place of kind of his home base, right? This is the point from which he's launching his activism. Is a community that is very much held up by the efforts of women, who are often, to this day, even in many of the major narratives about that movement, are women. Everyone from, Mother Clara Muhammad, who most people know as the wife of Elijah Muhammad, but as a matter of fact, I learned particularly from the testimony of the granddaughter of Elijah and Clara, that it was actually Clara Muhammad who introduced Elijah Muhammad to Master Fard Muhammad, who was the founder of the movement. And so without Clara Muhammad, there is no Nation of Islam, there is no Malcolm, there is no Elijah Muhammad, there is no Ali, right? There's none of that, right? And there are countless, everyone from, Elijah Muhammad's daughters to other women who are nameless and worked in the mosque and supported, the efforts in whatever way through their labor. This is a very common characteristic of religious organizations and political movements, right? Where the women's history is erased, and I definitely